Thank you all for being here. So nice to have you in the theater. My name is Tyler Morgenstern. I am the Assistant Director of the Carsey-Wolf Center and a big fan of musicals. So it is my great pleasure tonight to welcome our special guest for the evening, Christopher Willis.
Hi, everyone.
So, plenty to talk about. And it's such a delight to have you here. For those of you who've been sort of part of the Carsey-Wolf Center community for a while, you may have attended a screening a while ago of a film called Lamia's Poem, directed by Sam Cotty, who I believe is still with us here tonight, an animated feature which Chris scored for Sam. And back when we screened Lamia's Poem, Chris was nice enough to join us in the audience, and you were so lovely and gave us such a nice insight on your work with Sam that we decided to have you back on your own. So it's very nice to have you here.
It's so delightful to be here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. So to get started, I just thought, I mean, there's lots to talk about here. We can geek out about musicals in a minute, but just to give our audience a sense of where you're coming from and how you come to this project, I wonder if you can just talk to us a bit about your background. Because you've been working in film and television for a long time now, and you've worked on a number of projects that are really diverse in scope. So you've obviously worked on Schmigadoon, you've done a number of feature film projects with Armando Iannucci, but also television with Armando, so Veep, The Death of Stalin, Personal History of David Copperfield.
That's right.
And you've done a lot of animation work with Sam, but also serial animation for Disney and various other projects, and even work with theme parks. You've composed area music and other kind of work for theme and tourist attractions. So I wonder how you get to all of that work from what your background is, which is decidedly more academic. You have a PhD in musicology from Cambridge, specializing in 18th century music and composition and piano. So I just wonder if you can chart for us how you get from Cambridge musicology to working in the sort of work you do now.
Sure, yeah. Well, so yeah, my background was definitely classical music. I was, as a teenager, I was besotted with classical music and got really into the piano, was playing the piano an enormous amount. But before then, I think I was just, as a kid, I was just a fan of music generally. My brothers and I were listening to anything, and we were also big pop culture fans, just sort of just getting hold of everything we could and loving it and filming things on camcorders with little Star Wars figures and cutting stuff out and trying to do animation. And so, I mean, when I was heavily into classical music and thought, age sort of 20, that was all I was going to do, I think I sort of forgot that my childhood had been like that, but it sort of gradually came back to me. So I sort of, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do within classical music. So I was playing the piano a lot. I did the undergrad at Cambridge, which is actually a very academic undergrad. There's a sort of traditional path into classical music in the UK, which is a lot of people go to Oxford and Cambridge, but they don't study their instrument there. It's sort of a little bit like someone becoming an actor, but studying English, which again in the UK, lots of people do. People like Emma Thompson and John Cleese and Michael Palin and Hugh Laurie. All of these people went to Oxford and Cambridge and didn't study acting. They just did acting on the side. It's very sort of English somehow. So lots and lots of musicians did that too. So I did that undergrad. So that was sort of open-ended. But even into my early 20s, I was playing the piano and sort of a concert pianist in my early 20s. But I was kind of moving. I was getting really excited again about musicology, having been out for a year or two. And I was writing music the whole time, but I was struggling with the avant-garde scene, which was very, very spiky and difficult in this sort of mid-late 90s in the UK. So I was composing, but it was very difficult to envisage becoming a concert composer. I went back to Cambridge again and did a musicology master's and then a PhD. And during that time, I really started to remember how much I'd loved films. And actually, my musicological work had been going in a sort of narrative direction of thinking about narrative. So I was doing a lot of music analysis. But when you start to analyze sort of stranger classical composers that people find difficult to talk about. So I was talking about Scarlatti a lot. Scarlatti is very strange. One way that you might go is to start talking about narrative. I think that the connection between music and narrative is so big and so overwhelming that it's actually very difficult for us to pull back and really see it. I mean, the way that they both unfold temporally means that they're like each other in ways that we find hard to even see the wood from the trees on. If you analyze the way that you talk about a piece of music, you're constantly saying things that are sort of story-like about it. So all of that's to say that I was already thinking a lot about narrative by the time I was sort of in my mid-20s, and then I started buying bits of equipment and trying to figure out on the grapevine how film music worked. There was a weird period in there where I was still teaching, you know, as a sort of TA, tutor type person in Cambridge. So I was teaching, you know, 18th century music classes, but my room that I was teaching in was filling up with synthesizers and computers. So people were coming to talk about Rameau and Couperin and stepping over cables and past, you know, synthesizers. And in the middle of my PhD, I did actually get in touch with a film composer, and I was in this weird double life situation. Actually, I literally came to LA for a month to do a little bit of work, you know, but I was supposed to be in Cambridge, and I just went back. You know, it was very, very mad.
It's like a Teen Wolf scenario. You're like secretly like a film composer in like your bathroom.
Exactly. Or like Mrs. Doubtfire, where he's running between two. Yeah. So on paper, there was a moment that looks very, very surreal, where I finished my PhD, and I did a bit more teaching, and I wasn't sure what I was doing, but suddenly an opportunity came up in LA, and I suddenly dropped everything. I was on the cusp of doing a postdoc and teaching even more and taking on more and more students, and suddenly an opportunity came up to work in LA, and I suddenly just had to drop everything. What you'll notice is I never studied film music in any of that. Right. That actually used to be more normal. You know, now there are a lot of film music courses that you can take, but those have taken a long time to become established. So for a long time, it was something that people just came into from classical music and learnt on the job. And then there was an era when there were lots of band leaders, and then there were some people that had been songwriters and in rock bands, but they were all learning on the job. And that's very much what I did. So I became an absolute beginner when I arrived in LA. The person I came to be someone's assistant, and he was impressed by all the musical things that I knew, but basically I knew nothing about composing to film. And it was sort of like being a student still, you know, or learning a trade, really, or being a painter in the Renaissance, starting with tiny menial tasks and gradually doing bigger ones. And this is under somebody else's name, and this is very, very common in Hollywood. Has always been. So, the named composer has employees who are helping that person get the job done.
So it was really sort of like an early interest in pop culture, and then eventually just sort of an interesting break happens in LA.
Yeah, that's right, and a bit of a white knuckle situation, honestly.
Yeah, well, fascinating. Well, I did want to pick up on something that you had mentioned, which is about your training in musicology and music analysis and these sorts of things, because the sorts of projects that you've worked on over the past several years, I'm struck by the way that they tend to exist in very specific narrative universes, right? A project like this, these are very period-bound, highly stylized worlds, right? That exist in specific moments in music history, specific moments in film history, or something like the death of Stalin takes place in a very specific cultural and historical context that brings with it its own musical cues, its own cultural textures, and these sorts of things. And so I'm wondering if you might talk a bit about how your training in musicology prepares you to take on the work of creating music for those very specific kinds of worlds.
Cool, yeah. Well, that's well observed, and that's exactly right. And I never intended to become that person, but yeah, you know, there were probably times when I first moved to LA where I thought and acted like nothing that I'd done before that point would ever be relevant again. Right. Actually, I didn't say I was in Hans Zimmer's studio. It was the first place that I arrived in, and the whole state to sort of give you a little sense of the film music scene. Hans has a number of other composers that he works with, that he's friendly with. That whole part of the scene is known for being very technologically advanced. They're always very fashion forward. They've always got the latest thing. They were the first to use samples and the first to use computers and do things on an industrial scale. You know, you'd walk in and realize they were using 20 computers to do something.
Right.
But harmonically minimalist, right? Sort of by design. You know, that's the sort of thing that one generally knows about Hans and about those composers. So there were times back then when I thought that I was never going to need any of my sort of harmonic skills. All I needed to do was learn all of this stuff that I knew nothing about. But weirdly, sort of, you know, the past catches up to you.
Right.
And I totally ended up kind of, you know, my destiny was to be the sort of musicology person. So it's true. Even Veep is sort of set in a kind of Americana place. Yeah, he's got a sort of Sousa, Copeland, John Adams, a sort of imaginary history of like, what would it sound like if there was a person that was the midpoint of them or something. And the Mickey Mouse cartoons that I started doing, they're all different, but each one involved doing a lot of homework. There might be one that's almost entirely flamenco or one that's Bollywood. How is that? Clearly, I must be using musicology. I mean, music analysis is, you know, what you're supposed to be doing is listening closely and asking questions that other people don't ask. You know, why is this good? Why is this melody good and another melody is bad?
Right.
What am I expecting at this moment, and what actually happens? Trying to get to grips with harmonic systems quickly and then use them. To some extent, I think it was just my willingness to do homework. I mean, my familiarity after a humanities PhD with saying, okay, I know nothing about this thing. I'm going to read a book about it and I'm going to take notes. And it's going to make me not start writing for another few days, but that's what I'm going to do. And I just think a lot of other people in Hollywood aren't used to doing that.
Right.
So if you know, in a way, if I look in my big, you know, documents folder on my computer, there's no dividing line between the end of my PhD and the start of my career, because I just carried on making notes. You know, every good book, technical book that I picked up, I would start taking notes, and the notes just carried on. Right. You know, from 2006 when I was in Cambridge to 2007 when I was in Santa Monica.
Well, as a wayward humanities PhD, I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear that it stays with you. So let's talk about musicals. Yeah. Given the issue at hand. So I'm curious, how do you feel about musicals in general? Because coming to this project, you're obviously taking on a very specific task, and if you're talking about doing your homework, the homework here is to know a really deep well of musical history and movie musical history in particular. And this is such a joy to prepare for this conversation for me, because I love musicals, and I especially love movie musicals, as we were talking backstage. Yeah. I love the idea of a blank soundstage that you can turn into any kind of Fantasia thing. I love the way that filmmakers work with choreography and the edit and how all of these things come together. So I'm just wondering, what is your relationship to the musical and the movie musical? And from there, how did that interest or that relationship draw you into the project and the collaboration with Cinco, the creator of the show?
Right. Well, I'm not someone who knows all the musicals. I'm not someone who goes to the musicals and knows, you know, what all the new musicals are. I didn't really grow up that way. As I said, I was really more a sort of a classical music nerd. But from an early age, I was picking up on how great the movie musical tradition is. So I was closer to the movie musical tradition than musicals generally, which turned out to be fine, especially for the first season of Schmigadoon, because that's sort of what they were doing. So I was discovering those, and they were sort of a thread woven through all my teens, you know, kind of rehearsal pianist for Oklahoma here, and, you know, doing certain, you know, musicals at school. over there. My wife Elise is a bigger musicals fan than I am. She's the sort of person who'll go to New York just to spend 3 days watching musicals and then come back to LA again. When I got the gig, she was delighted, and we sat down and binged a lot of musicals that I had maybe seen once or not at all, and she knew kind of off by heart. On the other hand, there's a certain kind of research and a certain kind of listening that you never really do unless it's intentional. So I think even if I had been really, really into musicals in the normal sort of musicals fan way, kind of the Melissa kind of way, I still wouldn't necessarily have done the homework that I needed to do. And I talked a lot to the arrangers about this and to Cinco, because we all were really indulging that and going deep. And you're just asking yourself questions that you've never asked before. What exactly is the orchestration in Oklahoma? I'd seen Oklahoma before, but it was different to sort of go into it and look and actually to get hold of the scores of Oklahoma, which we were able to do. I actually the biggest admission, the biggest sort of learning and aha thing for me was that I hadn't realized how ingenious the underscore in those movie musicals is. I think it's actually more intricate in the way that I mean in the movies than it is in the Broadway shows. Right. What they're doing, if you go back and watch The Sound of Music or Oklahoma, is the underscore sounds like this great symphony that's been written entirely composed out of the musical material of the songs. Right. There's rarely a single phrase or a single sort of cell of music that isn't in some way related to one of the songs. And it's not simply giving you a splurge of one song that's relevant. It's definitely doing that. It's always commenting on the action in terms of the subject matter of the song, the title of the song, the lyrics from the song. But it's doing it with lots of songs alternating, and sometimes with them on top of each other. So I was watching Oklahoma and realized that in the on-track to the second half, you have Sorry with the Fringe on top and People Will Say We're in Love on top of each other for 16 bars or something. And it's just total tour de force. Somebody noticed that you can do that you can take two tunes and put them right on top of each other. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay, now I'm intimidated. But then the more I watched, the more I realized that that's happening all the time. Right. In The Sound of Music, they'll have a very deep conversation, and you'll hear one melody, and then at the end of that phrase, the comment, the phrase will be in the violins, but the comment in the English horn will be from a different song, and then you're back to the first song for the violins. So what I had to do on Schmigadoon, once I realized how crazy this was, and Cinco and I, were geeking out together, right, is get to know his songs incredibly well, which I'm sure is how the underscore composers of 70 years ago had to do it. It wasn't really good enough to have them around, to sort of to get to know them a bit. I had to really get to know them as well as I would know my own material if I were writing a conventional film score. So really that meant I had to play them in every key, and I had to really know them off by heart, basically. I couldn't just be sort of like doing that the whole time. So it's a very sort of specific skill that I was having to hone.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you're sort of anticipating my next question, which is great, because I do think so to clarify, the work that you did on this particular series is the underscoring.
That's right.
Right, where Cinco wrote and composed the sort of feature songs that have the vocal parts as well. But so I wonder if you could just clarify for us, for those of us who might not be familiar with these sort of more intricate things, like what the relationship is between the score and the score and the songs in something like a movie musical, which I'm just thinking this is now very front of stage. There's been some recent high celebrity moments of this, Billie Eilish and Phineas writing a song for Barbie while Mark Ronson is composing the score, and big celebrities now suddenly out in front of this. But I'm wondering if you can just clarify for us what that relationship is and how you and Cinco work together to create a sort of musical landscape for the project that's continuous and coherent, but that also highlights these individual feature songs?
Well, one thing to say is logistical. The songs have to be written when the material is being, when the script is being written, when the story is being hashed out. And some idea about the dance numbers has to be figured out also beforehand. So the song might go from synco to a vocal arranger who's going to, because of course the singers need to be able to sing the vocal arrangements on the stage, and then also to someone who's going to arrange the dance sequences. But that will be before shooting, so that might be that's in this case maybe in 2019 or something. Then it's shot. And after it's shot, once certain cuts and once certain changes have been made, then the business of fleshing out the song orchestrations can start, and the dance sequences. But really, that's when the underscore also starts. The underscore can't really start until it's already shot, because I'm responding to the timing of the scene. To the point of hitting, when Josh hits the bell in the inn, or things like that. Everything I'm doing is reacting to the picture. So I have to do it all very late on. Often, it's hard for you as the viewer to have any sense that those are two different things. In fact, you shouldn't. Right. Even if in this case the songs are being recorded in New York and the score is being recorded in LA. So stylistically, we're just having a lot of conversations about how we want it to sound and the references, and even how we want the mixes to feel. So basically, if nobody's singing or dancing, then it's me. But if they're singing or dancing, then it's Cinco and or the New York team. Right. And I think it's probably about half and half. It's going back and forth all the time. Right.
Well, I want to pick up on something else that you said, which is, if there's musical fans in the audience, or maybe you're a new or burgeoning musical fan, this thing is overstuffed with an incredible range of source material, right? So,
that's right.
Even in the first season, when the body of work is maybe a little bit more stylistically coherent because it's all coming out of that golden age movie musical tradition, then by the time we get to the 70s in the second season, the shows are kind of stylistically of a piece, but Chicago is set in a different time period than Pippin is, or anything else, right? So there's a real range of stylistic variation across the two seasons, and even within a single season. So I'm wondering, if you're underscoring and you are tasked with creating all of this sort of connective material between the feature songs, anything that isn't singing and dancing, how are you bringing together themes and references and textures from, just to run a few down, we have Schmigadoon, we have Music Man, we have Sound of Music, we have Carousel, Annie Get Your Gun. That's just season 1. Season 2, we have Chicago, Sweeney Todd, Company, Hair, Pippin, Cabaret, Sweet Charity, Chorus Line, Dreamgirls, and on we go.
Yeah.
So these are all vastly different shows with their own sonic languages, with their own musical textures. How are you filling this in to make it feel like Schmigadoon or Schmicago, which is its own text, its own project?
Well, there's another layer which I'll start with, which is that when the season starts, actually when every episode in season 1 starts, we are back in now time, New York,
right.
Present day. And so the show has to do another little thing that hopefully most people are barely even aware of, which is, of course, there's music. It's an Apple dramedy. It has to sound like that, whatever that is. And it doesn't really have very long to establish that.
Yeah.
But we were playing around with it at an early stage, and it just dawned on us that there was really no other, what am I going to do? I'm going to write a dumb little sort of 2021 kind of tune that only plays when they're in New York and then has no musical connection to Schmigadoon. That's sort of weird. No, that's not what you should do at all, we've realized. It should be all of the same melodies as are in the actual town of Schmigadoon. And it should be commenting on the action in exactly the same way, even though it's these verby guitars and it's these sort of indie textures and drum kit and just trying to sound like it's a Netflix show. So one of the things that Cinco's been one of the things that Cinco's been so happy about to report is that if you watch especially if you watch the show several times, you'll realize that in that first montage, you're actually hearing song melodies, quite a few song melodies from the show, and they're all commenting on the action, and maybe in some cases telling you things that you don't know. And the same thing in the big montage at the start of the second season. And it's funny, the fact that it's very indie actually is no impediment to being clever. So when I'm just trying to think. Yeah, when Josh and Melissa kiss in the montage at the start of the second season, we're hearing "Somewhere Love Is Waiting for You" and "Happy Beginnings" at the same time on top of each other. So that was one thing. But stylistically, it just wanted to sound. It just wanted to go under your conscious radar, I suppose. Just sound, as I say, Netflixy.
Yeah. Content.
Season 1, to go back to sort of the real meaning of your question, season 1 was less tricky because Schmigadoon is borrowing from all these things, but kind of adding up to something that we kind of know when we see it. This sort of Music Man, pinstripe, olden days, sort of gay 90s almost kind of thing. It still presents a few challenges, because what do you do with that when it goes slightly out? Like, what does the bad boy sound like? Or what does it sound like at the end of the first episode when you're supposed to be in that world, but there's a magic, there's a weird bit of magic. Like, are there any musicals where it gets freaky like that? So actually you start dipping in, you're still in the 50s.
Brigadoon, famously not magical at all.
Well, it is, right, that's a great example. It is, but if you go off thinking, I'm going to steal from Brigadoon, so you go watch the whole of Brigadoon, it's never really freaky, it just happens. It's just sort of, it's just considered great that Brigadoon is magical, and so you watch the whole thing and you still don't have that flavor. So I started dipping in more into like Twilight Zone, Vertigo, things like, trying to conjure up the vibe. You start having to, brain starts having to go in these funny places. And so to take us to season 2, we were talking about this beforehand a bit, weren't we? As you say, the musicals are all over the place, and the movie part of it is very confusing, because a lot of them were only turned into movies sort of 20 years later, or they were turned into very strange movies that nobody remembers, or they weren't turned into movies at all, like Pippin, which still hasn't, there's been no movie of Pippin, and still, to some extent, those sort of suggest some sort of middle ground. I suppose the Candor and Ebb part was helpful there. Even there, it's crazy. It partly was a case of just jumping around and not worrying too much about it. When Jenny pops in, suddenly it's cabaret, it's the tack piano, and it's the cabaret group. When we go to the hippies, it's just suddenly that. It's suddenly the
Jesus Christ Superstar.
The guitar with the flanger and its hair and it's all of that. And Sweeney Todd, suddenly we go into the Sweeney Todd bit in another episode, and we're just suddenly there. But again, there are places where the underscore needs to do a thing, and it's not exactly like any of the musicals. And this is sort of where film noir weirdly, just if you drew a big Venn diagram, you've got Chicago, you've got the old cars driving around, you've got certain harmonies, you've got the saxophones, you've got the jazzy thing. So yeah, you almost end up in a film noir-y place.
And it does become sort of a murder mystery courtroom drama.
Exactly, yes. Adolf Deutsch, there's a wonderful Adolf Deutsch score for a Steve Martin film that was in the 70s, possibly the last score that he did. Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid, and that's useful. And we were talking about Roger Rabbit. These scores that are very like full on, or Bugsy Malone actually, is not a musical that made it into it, but that, so the strange sort of lateral thinking in a way yielded for the first season some of this kind of Bernard Herrmann stuff, and in the second season some of this kind of film noir stuff.
Fascinating. And this maybe leads into my next question as well, which is, I mean, the differences narratively and thematically between the two eras of musicals are addressed in the show. I mean, Cecily very clearly announces at the beginning of the first season, right, these are going to be darker, they're more sexual, they're more violent, they're these things. So there's clear thematic and narrative differences, and yeah, by the time the musical hits the 70s, it all goes haywire narratively and stuff like that, and we got all these wacky shows. But I'm just wondering if you can put your musicologist hat back on. Are there sort of like distinctive musical textures, compositional things that happen in the earlier period that are really distinct from that 1970s period? And can you maybe highlight a few of those for us so when we go back to watch the rest of these seasons, we can be a bit more familiar with the kind of music we're actually listening to in the two different periods?
The earlier style, to some extent, I think one trick that I try and do is to just keep doing the mental experiment of peeling back the years and trying to banish thoughts of things that hadn't happened yet from your mind, which is easy to say. I'm not sure how helpful that is. But perhaps what's easier to do is to think, looking back a little bit from the era we're in. So what was in people's record collections? What were they listening to? They definitely, so we go to the big MGM movie musicals, Rodgers and Hammerstein, but also lots of great arrangers working there. Alfred Newman worked on some of them. I think in the 1940s and 1950s, a Hollywood musician's record collection had lots of light opera, lots of Johann Strauss, lots of classical music, and data moved more slowly then too. So perhaps things that had happened, something that Richard Strauss had done in 1925 was still something people were exploring in Hollywood in 1945, 1950, I gather that they were all going to the symphony all the time. When I was studying cartoon music, I was hearing about that the Hollywood composers were all meeting each other at the symphony. And when some strange new thing by Messiaen or Xenakis or whatever came over from Europe, they were all very interested to see what it was. So that's something that you'll hear a lot I keep reaching for a piano. In those big...
We should have set one up for you here. You could just illustrate the whole talk.
In those big movie musicals, you'll just hear a lot of this kind of romantic harmony, this sort of sideways movements that suggest, Rachmaninoff or Tchaikovsky or French things. So the song itself, especially if it's supposed to be in the Wild West or something, has this sort of studied simplicity to it, but then the underscore is going to somehow take that folksiness and find a way to make it symphonic and like, as I say, like the things perhaps that they were listening to. If you wind the clock on, it's, all of that is different. If you're in the 70s writing a musical, then presumably you're listening to stuff from the 60s, the late 60s. You're really interested in what's been happening in pop music, or jazz as well. So things are very different.
I think one of the things that's so great about the work that you and Cinco have done on this series is that the music, whether it's in the underscore and the themes that you're developing in the underscore or in the feature songs, they're very clearly, except with a couple of songs which are clear kind of spoof versions, right? There's a version of, there's a very clear spoof song that comes out of Sound of Music later in the first season that Cecily gets. But for the most part, there's a lot of songs, a lot of the feature songs are very clearly referential, but they're not like Weird Al like spoof songs, right? Cinco's not just sort of like replacing lyrics, and like when Cecily gets her sort of Maybe This Time song later in the second season, musically, compositionally, it's very clearly coming from maybe this time from cabaret, but it really stands on its own as its own piece of music and its own composition. It doesn't feel derivative, even though it's an homage, a very clear homage. Can you talk a little bit about striking that balance? Like, how do you, especially given that it's a comedy, it's supposed to be funny, it's supposed to be spoofy and tongue-in-cheek, but you want the music to be good too, presumably, and original. So can you talk about striking that balance a bit?
I remember being so struck when I very first heard it. A funny thing that happened actually is that Elise, my wife Elise, we were both hired on Schmigadoon separately, which we've sort of said means that we must be the two least cool people in Hollywood. This cutting-edge 1950s show. So she's a session singer. She's a singer, and she sang demo vocals. You know, when they were shooting, they needed demo vocals. So they had 4 people sing lots and lots, almost everything. And one of the things that she did stayed. So there is a solo that she did. It's not her on screen, but it's her in episode 3. There's a sort of opera lady. It's a little bit like an opera lady in How to Succeed in Business Without. When the opera lady stands on the table. It's kind of the reference. And then I got contacted about the show several months later, and it was totally unrelated. But I first heard her listening through, and we were both like, who is this person? What is going on here? Like, the comedy is very, very good. Has this really kind of good, you know, proper comedy feel. It's got real laughs. But as you say, it's not like every song is just nodding and winking. And there's a sort of, sometimes when a late night show throws a song together, you know, you get the whispered first verse, and then you get the middle, which is not very good, and then you immediately go to the big kind of, hey, big spender. You know, it just sort of cheats and doesn't really do, it's not doing any of that. It's way, way, way better than that. I mean, the truth is Cinco is just really good. He has been a musician longer than he's been a screenwriter, and he's always had this talent and this possibility, and it just finally, rather suddenly, came to fruition here in a public-facing way, but he actually, behind the scenes, has been great musically for a long time. There's a doc for each season with the songs listed and all of the references, so that everyone has a cheat sheet, so they know, because you know the choreography will nod at it, and the costumes and the acting and everything. But it's always a list of things, except for I think the song that you mentioned, the Sound of Music one. So it's in a way there's no possibility for it to do that, because it's trying to always triangulate between, you know, it might be musically there might be 4 different things, lyrically there might be 3, and one of them is not one of those 4, and the same goes for who's singing it, and so I suppose it just he set the tone for how to think about that it is referential, but you get docked brownie points for sort of just being too specific to one thing.
And just so, and we're going to open up to audience questions here in a moment, but just so you know, we've been evoking Cinco a lot. Cinco Paul is the creator of the show, co-writer of the show, and if you watch all the way through, watch to the very last frame of the last episode of the 2nd season for a brief cameo from Cinco Paul. Close watchers.
Did you just see that, or did you hear about that? Wow.
Yeah. He's sort of a friend of the center, so I was watching out for him. But
Right.
So I've talked a lot already, and I want to make sure we have some time for audience questions here. So if anybody has any audience questions, I'm going to turn over to my colleague Emily, who will give a couple of instructions.
I was curious how much of what we hear on screen was performed like by an orchestra, and how much was performed by maybe you or just a few people with synthesizers and that sort of thing.
It's funny that you should ask. I was just, while Emily was explaining, I was just thinking about things that hadn't come up. Season 1 was done in fairly deep lockdown. I guess actually by the time we were scoring, there were a few restrictions had been lifted, but I think life on set while they were shooting was grim. Everyone who's not in front of the camera is wearing a mask at all times and being tested every day and all of that kind of thing. And I think in a bubble too. So one of the great CG achievements actually is to take all of the sweat out of people's armpits, because clearly it was hot and they couldn't go anywhere and they couldn't leave the building. So a lot of the dance numbers, while I was scoring it, everyone looked really sweaty, and it looks amazing now. So it's incredible. So the scoring of the music, as I say, the songs were scored in New York, and I believe they rented out the whole of the power station studio in New York, all of the rooms at the same time, and did it that way. Underscore, as is typical with a musical thing, had a less budget than the songs. So all the musicians for the underscore were recorded on their own, one at a time. They came to my studio and they were in one room and I was in another. And we only had 4 musicians for the underscore. Violin, trumpet, guitar, and woodwinds, a Broadway-style woodwind doubler. But working that way is something that I've had a lot of practice on over the years. Not having them play individually, which I really don't like, but using a small group and then having everything that's prominent being played by someone real and everything that's not prominent being handled by a computer. It's just very, very common, something I've been doing with Disney for many years. And it's not fun, but it can be, if after many years of exacting practice, you can do it pretty well. Also, if you're tracking up, you can achieve a lot with only 4 people. Season 2 got a lot more complicated because the needs and the different styles were so different. There were heavily orchestral bits, and then there were these, hippie bits. So it pretty much doubled. But for various reasons, lockdown was not over, but was ending. But we did it the same way. Yeah, even if it is a small group, I do much prefer to record the people together. But yes, it's a tapestry, and the way to do it, in my opinion, is to be very strict about what the ensemble is supposed to be, even if some of it's not real people. So the orchestra, in my mind, has 2 flutes and 1 oboe and 2 clarinets, if one clarinet is a real person and another clarinet is a computer, that's fine. But I don't just start sort of adding more and more and more, because then you sort of just go down a weird path. And it's especially with this period stuff where there's a certain thing that you are going for.
So I'm probably not the only person in the room who now feels compelled to rewatch all of season 1 and all of season 2 and pay attention to the underscoring. One of the things you mentioned earlier was that in doing your own research, you watched Oklahoma, and you noticed this bit in the underscoring where Surrey and the Fringe on top, and I think it was people will say they are in love or are playing simultaneously.
Exactly.
So I'm wondering, are there some moments in the underscoring where you did something that you're particularly proud of as a composer, some kind of clever interplay of motives or something that we can listen for? It could be more than one if you're particularly proud of a few moments.
That's a great question. Well, the first moment that I tackled immediately after seeing that thing in Oklahoma and realizing that that the bar was that high, it's with all of your heart and I think with all of your heart and Somewhere Love Is Waiting For You. And there's an interstitial that uses both of them at the same time. And we are pondering the fact that Josh is trying to cross the bridge with every woman in town rather than doing the thing that he knows is right. So I realized this about Oklahoma and about all of these musicals. I got very stressed, and I figured that one out. And then I felt and I showed Cinco, and he noticed because he's a genius. And I felt much less stressed. But in some ways, some of the things I'm happiest about are lurking in in the indie modern music, because it's just so sort of stealth, and we're probably the only people in the world now, all of us in this room, that know that it's doing it. So I didn't score episode 1 right away for scheduling reasons. So I was already into that idea by the time I came to episode 1. So right away, all the way through that montage, you're hearing things. I think the very first thing you hear is the piano going C, C, G, which is Schmigadoon. Just the whole of that sequence is doing that. It's a bit pretentious. But if you're in a very diatonic context, there's a lot you can do. There's a famous bit in Meistersinger by Wagner where he has all the tunes at the same time. And it's great, but then once you sort of think about it, you're like, it's not that hard. So, so there's a lot of that going on in that very first montage, and again in the one in season 2. I feel like there's just a burbling at the edge of my consciousness. There's the odd other one. But yeah, those are the ones that come to mind.
As you mentioned, you're kind of paying like homage or little references to all these really popular musicals. Was there like a list of musicals that you could use, like you had permission to use bits of those songs, or were you kind of able to kind of pick ones you liked and then they were able to work with that? Like what were the limitations that came with that?
There were no limits actually, but there were invitations from Cinco to watch certain things. And when it came to season 2, where he clearly was struggling with the same thing that Melissa kind of goes meta and references that we've talked about, which is that people are a bit more confused about what they're supposed to be watching and what are the sort of canon musicals. He put together this epic YouTube playlist, including lots of very grainy Broadway versions of things. So there's a version of Pippin that he really wanted to reference, and it's like the video is sort of is completely warped. I'm trying to think of a time when he didn't want to go. This is so obvious, I suppose, but he didn't want to get too preoccupied with the movies that were made of classic 70s musicals later, because it just gets so confusing. The Tim Burton Sweeney Todd, or I think even more the great movie of Chicago, because it's really good, but just the grain of the film and the production values and the aesthetic are just of their own moment. So if you watch them too much, you sort of get confused. But he very keen on watching the stranger ones, even with apologies for things that didn't work. I watched the movie of Jesus Christ Superstar and just found it utterly baffling. That entire moment seems inexplicable to me. But I watched it. But whereas I really enjoyed the Hair movie is pretty weird too, but I really enjoyed that. And even the Godspell movie is just as weird as the Jesus Christ Superstar one, but I think it's rather wonderful. Everyone with the paint on their faces. We'll end with Godspell.
We'll end with Godspell. Well, everybody join me in thanking Chris for joining us this evening. And thank you all for coming out. So nice to have you here. Keep your eyes out for more programs coming up from the Carsey-Wolf Center, including our programs for next year. We'll be programming around the theme of panic, so keep an eye out for that.
Very cool.
Everybody have a lovely evening. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.